Hi, everybody. Welcome to this online class. We're going to get into how stories structure our lives and our society, and we're going to explore the analytical framework that Quinn gives us for understanding and also for liberating ourselves from stories that hold us captive. And in doing that, we're following up on our examination in the last unit of how society shapes our identities and what we know about the world. So we're going to start off with an introduction to the way that Quinn frames the problem in Ishmael concerning civilization and its relation to human beings and our identities. And we're going to review some of the key analytical concepts that we brought up in the last class and address some objections with that approach on the way to deepening our understanding of what he's providing for us. And then we're going to analyze the story of our culture, which in Ishmael is described as a taker culture. So let's start off with a question that's at the heart of our course ever since the first class. What is a human being? What does it mean to be a human being? To answer that question, we have to ask another question. What is civilization? Civilization, at very least, concerns the collective and organized ways that people act together. And it can't be defined without nature. For two reasons. One, civilization occurs within, is supported by, and is at the mercy of the natural world. If there were no oxygen, if there were no food that the rest of nature grows, then our civilization couldn't exist. And second, civilization is often defined through a distinction between civilization and nature. When someone says a person is civilized, for example, he usually means that that person has escaped some natural instinct, has avoided or suppressed or controlled some underlying impulse, and has elevated himself above his natural state. The assumption here is that in this contrast between civilization and nature, that nature is flawed in some way, and our as civilized beings is to improve on it, to be better than it, to escape it, to surpass it. Now, Ishmael's goal in this book is to show that this story of civilization, a story in which human beings are separate from nature, and that the purpose of nature is to serve us, that this story is flawed, that we need to fit within, belong to, emulate the natural world if we're going to survive. So he analyzes and dismantles the assumptions of this story about our separation from nature on the one hand, and then on the other hand, he doesn't stop there, because you can't remove a story that people are enacting just by disbelieving it. You can't remove a story that people are enacting unless you replace the story. So let's review for a moment. The technical achievement of Ishmael is to present a set of analytical tools that help us identify our society's structural mythology. Remember, a myth is a story that is so deeply embedded in our thinking and our practice that it doesn't occur to us to question it. We aren't even aware that we are telling this story. A story is defined as a scenario relating men, the world, and the gods. A culture is a people enacting a story, and to enact a story is to live so as to make a story a reality, to strive to make it true. We're going to examine in a moment how stories can hold us captive by enacting a story. But remember that a story is a scenario that interrelates man and describes our destiny as human beings, our purpose, but also the meaning of the world. What is the world? What is our role in the world? And the gods, what are the intentions for us and our purpose in the world? How are we related to the world? Why did things come to be the way that they are? So what is it to enact a story? To live in such a way that you make it true. But does this mean that enactment, the story that you're enacting, does this mean that it is false ahead of time? Does it mean that it's true afterwards? Are there better and worse stories that we could enact? Does being a bad story make it false. Stories do not have to be true before we live them, but living stories can be better or worse. A certain story can undermine my ability to live, my ability to thrive. For example, people might think that I am socially awkward, or they might think that I'm an extremely charming person. Whichever story it is that I am enacting, in enacting that story, I live in such a way as to make that true. And that puts pressures on me. It also causes real consequences in the world. So if I think that I'm socially awkward, I interpret the world through the story. I look for clues that indicate my awkwardness to me, and I reinforce my belief that I'm socially awkward. And in doing that, I act out the story. I get more nervous, and that makes me socially awkward. The stories, while I'm enacting them, become self-reinforcing. Quinn starts the book Ishmael with an exploration of the vague but very real feeling that we're somehow held captive. He describes both the narrator and the gorilla Ishmael as having a feeling of captivity that burns underneath their daily lives. And this leads them to question why. Why do I feel this way? The feeling of captivity, as Quinn is articulating it, is a desire to find a better way to live. And the teacher, in this case, Ishmael, helps to reveal our captivity. That is, Ishmael's purpose is to teach the narrator how to escape his captivity. And the first thing to do, of course, is to identify what is holding him captive. So here's a reflection for you. So pause the video in a moment and try to answer these questions for yourself. Do you feel captive in some way? What are you doing or thinking that leads you to feel this way? Is there a certain moment of the day or a certain memory that leads you to feel captive? To ask why? In what part of your life? About what things? So that's the first question. And the second question, how would you go about discovering what generates this feeling? That is, how would you go about discovering what is holding you captive? How do you find the bars of the cage that is holding you captive? So pause the video and answer that question, or those two questions, for yourself, and then come back to the recording. So the question, why do I feel this way? Why are things this way? Why do I feel imprisoned? Helps you notice and feel your captivity. This sense of questioning is a sign of your need to live, to flourish, and it's the beginning of a search for answers. So the question why is both an opening to and propelled by our need, our desire to live. And it's, of course, the fundamental question of philosophy. So Quinn's contribution to this examination of captivity is to show how stories hold us captive. That is, captivity is being held and forced to interact with a story that others or ourselves are enacting in the world. So we're held captive by others who are enacting a story. And as they enact that story, they force us to respond to and take a role in the story as they are telling it. Now, we often feel captive in these situations, but then try to live with it, try to reconcile ourselves with our captivity. And in doing that, we have to submerge or dismiss or swallow the question, why? We have to reject the feeling of being lied to about ourselves or about the world. The main example that Ishmael gives to illustrate the power of a story to hold people captive is Nazi Germany. So in Book 2, Chapter 1, Ishmael says, "It was not only the Jews who were captive under Hitler. The entire German nation was a captive, including his enthusiastic supporters. Some detested what he was doing, some just shambled on as best they could, and some positively thrived on it. But they were all his captives." "I think I see what you mean," said the narrator. "What was it that held them captive?" The narrator responds, "Well, terror, I suppose." Ishmael shook his head. "You must have seen films of the pre-war rallies, with hundreds of thousands of them singing and cheering as one. It wasn't terror that brought them to those feasts of unity and power." True, said the narrator. Then I'd have to say it was Hitler's charisma. And Ishmael responds, he certainly has that. But charisma only wins people's attention. Once you have their attention, you have to have something to tell them. And what did Hitler have to tell the German people? What he had to tell them was a story. A story in which the Aryan race and the people of Germany in particular had been deprived of their rightful place in the world, bound, spat upon, raped, and ground into the dirt under the heels of mongrel races, communists, and Jews. A story in which, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, the Aryan race would burst its bonds, wreak vengeance on its oppressors, purify mankind of its defilements, and assume its rightful place as the master of all races. So that's the story, as Ishmael tells it. But then he adds, I'm telling you this because the people of your culture are in much the same situation. And the question, of course, that we need to ask about this, just as we asked about Plato's cave, is why? About what things? In what way are the people of our culture held just as much captive to a story as the people in Hitler's Germany? But before we get into that analysis, which will analyze our culture's central story, our central mythology, it's useful to focus in on the fact that captivity is very personal. So here's a question for you to reflect on. Have you been in a romantic relationship before? Have you fallen in love with somebody? Now ask yourself, have you felt that one person in that relationship loved or was more attracted to the other? Did you think that the one who loves more was you, or the one who loves less is the other person? That story that you are the one who loves more, that the other person loves less, that story has real intimate implications. The one who loves more might deceive herself about the relationship, might make more of small expressions of love from their partner than are intended. The one who loves less might play up their interest, overstate the kind of love that they have for the other person. They might try to deceive themselves as well. They're both locked into a story. They're both captive to this story of loving more and loving less. Another example comes from a Muslim woman who was speaking at a conference that I went to a while back. And she received a question from the audience: how can you be a woman and a feminist and also at the same time wear the hijab? Hijab, a sign of men controlling women's sexuality. And she says, in response to this question, do you think that people in my culture are the only ones who are held captive by this story about women's sexuality? She points out a very interesting problem. She says, in Western culture too, women are also held captive in a story that instead of forcing women to cover up their bodies, forces them, on the one hand, to show their bodies more than men do, and then on the other hand, forces them to cover their bodies just enough. So the kind of control that women need to have of their appearance is very much present in our culture as well. Try asking this sometime of your women friends. How many women regularly think about how to balance the amount that they reveal in their clothing and the amount that they cover up? And then ask the men. How many men think regularly about how much they should reveal of their bodies and how much to cover up? Captivity is very personal, and it goes all the way down into our individual experience of ourselves. Now, captivity is personal, but it's also civilizational. So we need to look at the way that captivity is civilizational. And here's the passage that I think is the most clearly related to this idea in the opening books. In book 1, section 6, or chapter 1, section 6, Ishmael says, "My subject is captivity." Captivity, says the narrator. That's correct. I sat there for a minute and then I said, I'm trying to figure out what this has to do with saving the world. Ishmael thought for a moment. Among the people of your culture, which want to destroy the world? Which want to destroy it? As far as I know, no one specifically wants to destroy the world. And yet you do destroy it, each of you. Each of you contributes daily to the destruction of the world. Yes, that's so. Why don't you stop? I shrugged. Frankly, we don't know how. And Ishmael responds, you're captives of a civilizational system that more or less compels you to go on destroying the world in order to live. Yes, that's the way it seems. So you are captives, and you have made a captive of the world itself. That's what's at stake, isn't it? Your captivity and the captivity of the world. Later in that section, Ishmael says, I think there are many among you who would be glad to release the world from captivity. I agree. What prevents them from doing this? I don't know. This is what prevents them. They are unable to find the bars of the cage. So let's look at that question. And this is a moment of reflection. Do you agree with that claim that we are destroying the world and that we don't know how to stop? If you agree with that, what are the reasons that you agree with that? What things lead you to think that we are destroying the world? And what are the reasons that you think that we are unable to stop? So if you agree that we are destroying the world, if you agree that civilization is wreaking havoc in the world, how long do you think we have? Write down an answer. How long do you think human beings have before the destruction that we are wreaking on the world takes us out with it, before civilization starts to crumble? If you don't think that civilization is going to crumble, write down an answer. But if you do, how long? How many years? How many centuries? If it's centuries. So take a moment and think that through. So pause the video and then come back in a moment. If you think that we are destroying the world, and if you think that there's only a matter of time before our culture undermines itself, why aren't we excited about it? Why aren't we out in the streets protesting? Why aren't we devoting everything to solving this problem? Why don't we care? There's a really good Saturday Night Live segment that talks about this. In Book 2, Chapter 7, Ishmael talks about the fact that we don't get too excited about this. He says, one of the pupils I mentioned yesterday felt obliged to explain to me what she was looking for. And she said, why is it that no one is excited? I hear people talking in the laundromat about the end of the world, and they're no more excited than if they were comparing detergents. People talk about the destruction of the ozone layer and the death of all life. They talk about the devastation of the rainforests, about deadly pollution that will be with us for thousands and millions of years, about the disappearance of dozens of species of life every day, about the end of speciation itself. And they seem perfectly calm. I said to her, is this what you want to know then? Why people aren't excited about the destruction of the world? And she thought about that for a while. And she said, no, I know why they're not excited. They're not excited because they believe what they've been told. I said, yes? What people have been told keeps them from being excited. It keeps them relatively calm when they view the catastrophic damage they're inflicting on the planet. What have they been told? I don't know. They've been told an explaining story, an explanation for how things came to be this way. And this stills their alarm. This explanation covers everything, including the deterioration of the ozone layer, pollution of oceans, the destruction of the rainforests, even human extinction. And it satisfies them. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that it pacifies them. They put their shoulders to the wheel during the day, stupefy themselves with drugs or television at night, and try not to think too searchingly about the world they're leaving their children to cope with. So what is the story that pacifies us? There's something about this story that pacifies us in the face of what we see is happening, namely the destruction of the natural world on which we depend. What is that story, and what is it about that story that pacifies us? We'll only really be able to answer that question once we analyze our story. In order to do that, we have to face an objection. In order to understand the one story that our culture has, in order to understand that we have only one story that we are telling, we have to face some objections. So Quinn gives the narrator a task: identify the one story that we tell in our culture. And the narrator responds in this way: I don't know any one story, Ishmael says. It's the one story that everyone in your culture knows and accepts. I'm afraid that doesn't help much. Perhaps it'll help if I tell you it's an explaining story, like how the elephant got its trunk or how the leopard got its spots. Okay. And what do you suppose this story of yours explains? God, I have no idea, says the narrator. That should be clear from what I've already told you. It explains how things came to be this way, from the beginning until now. I see, I said, and stared out the window for a while. I'm certainly not aware of knowing such a story. As I said, stories, yes, but nothing like a single story. So the claim is that there is an underlying unified story, a cultural myth that we are enacting. How do we have a story that structures our lives that we aren't even aware of knowing? Well, that is what a myth is, properly speaking. Something so basic that we aren't aware of it. Something so basic that it hasn't even occurred to us to wonder if it's true. It's like the water that a fish swims through, the air that we breathe. It's so prevalent around us that it's invisible to us. So the question, of course, is it really true? How could that possibly be true? And there are several ways of going about trying to answer that question. First of all, we can give some examples, right? We can show that we know stories that we aren't aware of, and that we know these stories in incredibly exacting detail. The second is to show that these stories aren't inherent or natural, that they originate in culture. And if we look, we can start to see the pattern of that story in different places. So we have to show that we know stories we aren't aware of, they appear in different places, and that these stories are not inherent or natural. So to show that there is a single story in our culture, it's very useful for us to give an example that illustrates that we can find out this single story from many different sources. So there are two steps to responding to this objection. The first step, to show that we know a story that we aren't aware of knowing, and we know it in an incredibly exacting and precise way. And the second thing we need to show is that this story is present in many places in our culture, that it shows up. We encounter it in many different instances all over the place in our culture. So that's what we need to show. So let's look at an example. And this might seem like a weird question, but how many different stories are there in the movies? We might think that there are an infinite number of stories in the movies, but actually no, there are only a few different stories, and we know all of them, or almost all of them. Thousands of movies come out every year that are almost identical in form and premise. So I'm going to try starting to tell a story, and I want you to try to fill in the details as soon as you know what happens next. And so I'm going to tell you this story, the opening of this story, and I want you to pause the video and write down the answer that you have. Write down what happens after that, and then come back and see how our presentations of the story line up. So here's the beginning of the story. A group of attractive young people are driving along a lonely country road. So pause the video and write out what happens next. Don't just jump to the end, but write it out step by step. What happens next? And then what happens after that? So pause the video and write out what happens. Okay, so now that you've written out what happens in this story, hopefully all the way to the very end, here's an example of what happens. A group of attractive young people are driving along a lonely country road, and their car breaks down. Their cell phones don't work, so they are unable to contact anyone, and they all get out of the car. And when they get out of the car, they see a house down in the valley. And then they decide to send someone over to the house, or maybe they all go to the house to see if they can get help. They show up at the house, and it's empty. There's no one there. And so they split up to try to find help or resources or phone or it doesn't matter. They split up. And when they split up, they start to get picked off one by one by some kind of monster or a deranged person. It's only when two of them band together and have each other's backs that they survive. So what kind of film is it? How do we know it in so much detail? Where did you learn it from? To figure out why this story is a single unified story, even though you've seen it in a bunch of different places, you need to analyze its form, or to put it in Ishmael's terms, its premise. The form of the film, the premise of the film, is the underlying story that it is telling. And this underlying story, the premise, can appear in a bunch of different films. So how do you figure out what a premise is? First, you describe everything that you see in an organized way. And second, you ask why it is that way, what it means for it to be that way, what effects or consequences it has. There's a really useful video by Patrick Williams on how to analyze movies. The way that he analyzes it is as follows. To understand a story's premise, you need first to describe the central conflicts, events, and characters. And as you are describing it, you need to simplify the description while staying accurate. You need to remove the individual features and look for something universal. Now that you've described and boiled down the description to just the basics, now you can articulate the themes of the story. Then you go back to the story, ask, what does the story say about those themes? Why is it that way? What is it communicating about those themes? Okay, so the form of the film that we just described is a horror, but the form of the film is indicated in people splitting up. People who are in trouble splitting up. The message, the underlying story of the film, the horror genre, is that the breakdown of community leaves us vulnerable. Vulnerable to what? Well, the monster or the person who is preying on everyone else, the threat, is often someone who has been excluded, right? Someone's given birth to a monster, or someone has been abandoned and they prey on the community. Or it's a monster that people have been persecuting and it decides to take revenge. The breakdown of the community leaves us vulnerable to what the community excluded, and only the people who organize together in community will survive. That's the underlying structure of a horror movie. For extra credit, try doing this with other genres. Distill the plot down to its very basics and then look for the premise. Movies that don't follow the formula, the premise, make people mad. The Last Jedi, for example, subverted genre expectations about its heroes. And for that reason, a lot of people got really angry. Imagine a tragedy if the two characters get married at the end. Or a romantic comedy where the two characters die in a car crash at the end. This isn't part of the form. The form that we expect puts pressure on the story to be a certain way. So many movies have the same plot and fit the genre so exactly. They're all telling the same story. And the same is true for our society. The same is true for the story that governs our society, that we are enacting. One more thing that we need to talk about before we examine the story of our culture. How do we learn these stories? How can we get a single unified premise from all these different stories? Quinn has a very interesting way of describing this. This is in Book 2, Chapter 4. He says, Mother Culture, whose voice has been in your ear since the day of your birth, has given you an explanation of how things came to be this way. You know it well. Everyone in your culture knows it well. But this explanation wasn't given to you all at once. No one ever sat you down and said, here is how things came to be this way, beginning 10 or 15 billion years ago, right up to the present. Instead, you assembled the explanation like a mosaic from a million bits of information presented to you in different ways by other people who share the same explanation. And you assembled it together from the table talk your parents had, the cartoons you watched on television, Sunday school lessons from your textbooks and your teachers, news broadcasts, movies, novels, sermons, plays, newspapers, and all the rest. So we're given pieces of the story. We're given fragments. And when we gradually figure out how to put them together, a story arises from those fragments. And we start to use that unified story to add the missing parts to the story. There's a really interesting insight here. Our beliefs are like a log raft. No one thing is buoyant enough to hold us up, to hold our weight on its own. But when they're stitched together, they won't sink. Think about it this way. If you've ever had a conversation with someone who's a conspiracy theorist, one thing will almost inevitably happen. If you start to question a certain assumption or premise or belief that they have, they won't stick with it. They will shift to another. And we're like that with our beliefs. Almost all of us are like that. Instead of actually removing something that has been refuted from our belief system, we kind of leave it there and we shift to another belief, another log that we've tied together on the raft. In philosophy, we try to remove those problematic concepts, just like people do in science. But our beliefs tend to be like that. Even though they're cobbled together, they're extraordinarily resilient. They hold together because we've stitched them together, not necessarily because they're true. And this is how propaganda works too. You say something enough times in different ways, and people will stitch it together, and it doesn't matter if it's true. The things that people say will fit the structure that you've already built out of the component parts that have been provided to you. So, there's one story, Quinn argues. It's completely unified. We get it from a million different locations, and we assemble it ourselves, which means, just like in the movie Inception, it's much more likely that we are to believe it if we came up with it ourselves. So there's one story from a million sources. We have assembled it ourselves. Now we need to examine what that story is. And Quinn gives a name to this story. That name is the name of our culture, the taker culture. And he contrasts that with the leaver culture. We are the takers. Later on, we'll talk about the leaver culture, the culture that is dramatically different than ours, and that gives us the opportunity to learn about how to live in a sustainable way. Instead of rehashing the example that is provided in Ishmael, which you're already familiar with, I thought it would be useful to look at how the story that he's talking about is embedded in our scientific literature by looking at this chart, for example. This is a chart that is meant to indicate the history of the whole universe on the scale of a single calendar year. In January, we get the Big Bang. In February, March, and April, we have the formation of galaxies. In May, we have the Milky Way form. The solar system appears in August. In September, the first life appears on Earth. In October, we have cells with a nucleus. November, we have multicellular life. And in December, a whole lot of stuff happens. Once we get to December 17th, we have animal fossils for the first time. On the 20th, land plants appear. Insects and amphibians appear in the next couple of days, and then reptiles on the 24th of December. Dinosaurs on the 25th. Mammals appear on the 26th. Then birds and flowers emerge on the 28th. On the 29th, dinosaurs are at the top of the food chain. On the 30th, the dinosaurs go extinct, and mammals start to diversify, and some of them return into the sea. And on the 31st, human beings evolve. First, it starts off with the divergence between human beings and apes, and then different types of human being appear. Homo erectus, Neanderthal man. They all appear, and the other human beings get selected out, leaving only us. This is an example of a story structure. Why is it a story structure? This is beautifully illustrated in the example that Ishmael gives about the jellyfish. He describes the same story: the Big Bang emerging, the Milky Way forming, life emerges, etc. But the story is told by a jellyfish, and the jellyfish says proudly at a certain point, "Then jellyfish emerged," and that was the end of the story. So the story is that the entire universe culminates in us. The story is entirely composed of facts, but the structure of the story, the orientation, the organization of the story indicates that the universe came to be and that its greatest final act is us. We are the direction, the destiny of the universe. So Ishmael uses this example to show that the underlying assumption of these stories are that we are the end and goal of creation, but that there's no evidence that we are the pinnacle or the goal or the end of creation. The entire structure of the story is, as it were, a cone headed towards us, and we are the very tip of the cone. From a biological standpoint, however, that's quite untrue. We're not the tip of a cone. All the other living things that currently exist are also the latest and greatest, the outcome of creation. But the processes of creation haven't ended either. We will continue for a while. When human beings die out, some other animals will continue on after us. Some other plants will continue on after us. We are not the culmination of creation. But if we tell the story in the structure that we've seen in this diagram, the premise of the story is that the world was made for man. The world was made for us. It came into being for our sake. And if that is true, then the world belongs to us. So that's the underlying premise. That's the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story is that the world was made for man. And if this is true, then the world belongs to us. Its destiny is for us to use it. Our use of it, of course, is problematic. We're damaging the natural world. We're undermining our own ability to live in certain ways. Why aren't we excited about those things? Well, the story blames our use of things on the gods, that it was meant to be this way. It says the purpose of the cosmos is for us to use it. So there can't be any problem with us using it or using it up. So that pacifies us. Because the world came to be this way, we are meant to use it. So let's have a look at another couple of examples of how this story works. So another example is Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, a really tremendous and creative, very eloquent Christian thinker, has the following written in his Summa Contra Gentiles, book 3, chapter 22. And you'll notice that the form of the argument that he provides here is identical to the one that we just saw in that scientific chart. He says, the ultimate end of the whole process of generation, that is, the entire cosmos, all change and coming to be and passing away. The ultimate end of the whole process of generation is the human soul. And matter, that is, matter itself, tends toward the human soul as toward an ultimate form. What's the proof? He says the proof is given by the process of generation, because in the fetus, we are first living with a plant life, then with an animal life, and lastly with a human life. After this, no later or more noble form is to be found. Therefore, the last end of all generation is the human soul, and to this does matter tend as to its ultimate form. So the underlying argument is exactly the same as we saw in the scientific depiction of the Big Bang leading to human life. Here's another example from a popular book summarizing the science of our coming to be, The Story of Everything, A Short History of Everything. So for extra credit, you can take this section and you can analyze how the story functions. In what way does this depiction of the science of the natural world establish human beings and our importance in the world? And here's the second page of that same reading. Now, the middle of the story, the middle of the Taker story, is very, very important. The beginning was the world was made to man. The middle of the story is that man was made to rule it. If the world was made for us, it isn't turning out to be very good at following our direction. So the beginning of the Taker story is that the world was made for man. But we have to understand what it means for it to be made for us. If it was made for us, theoretically, then the animals would lie down in front of us and invite us to eat them. If it was made for us, we wouldn't have to work for our food. We wouldn't have to work to establish ourselves in the world. But we do. Why is that? And what does it mean for us to be the purpose, the destination, the reason for the natural world to exist? A really good section to understand this is in chapter 4, section 3. And I'm going to read this. It's fairly long, but it illustrates something very useful about our understanding of the natural world and what our role is in it. It touches on a kind of bodily belief or feeling that we have about the natural world that is intimately linked with the purpose that we see ourselves having in the natural world. So here's the section. As we saw yesterday, Ishmael says, creation wasn't complete when jellyfish appeared, or amphibians or reptiles appeared, or even when mammals appeared. According to your mythology, it was complete only when man appeared. Right. Why was the world and the universe incomplete without man? What did the world need man for? I don't know. Well, think about it. Think about the world without man. Imagine the world without man. Okay, I said, and closed my eyes. A couple minutes later, I told him I was imagining the world without man. What's it like? I don't know. It's just the world. Where are you? What do you mean? Where are you looking at it from? Oh, from above, from outer space. What are you doing up there? I don't know. Why aren't you down on the surface? I don't know. Without man on it, I'm just a visitor, an alien. Well, go on down to the surface. Okay, I said, but after a minute I went on to say, that's interesting. I'd rather not go down there. Why? What's down there? I laughed. The jungle is down there. I see. You mean nature, red in tooth and claw, dragons of the prime that tear each other in their slime. That's it. And what would happen if you did go down there? Well, I'd be one of the ones the dragons were tearing in their slime. I opened my eyes in time to see Ishmael nodding and saying, and it is at this point that we begin to see where man fits into the divine scheme. The gods didn't mean to leave the world a jungle, did they? You mean in our mythology? Certainly not. So without man, the world is unfinished. It was just nature, red in tooth and claw. It was in chaos, a state of primeval anarchy. That's right. That's it exactly. So it needed what? It needed someone to come in and straighten it out. Someone to put it in order. And what sort of person is it who straightens things out? What sort of person takes anarchy in hand and puts it in order? Well, a ruler, a king, of course. The world needed a ruler. It needed man. Yes. So now we have a clearer idea what this story is about. The world was made for man, and man was made to rule it. Yes, that's very obvious now. Everyone understands that. And this is what? What? Is this a fact? No. Then what is it? It's mythology, I said, of which no trace is to be found in your culture. So you see how the attitude that we have, the feeling that nature is hostile somehow, that it's an anarchy, a place that is dangerous to us, and that in order to live there, we have to set it in order, that we have to control it. Take a moment and think through some ways that this is expressed in our culture. Take a moment and write down some answers to that question. How is this ruling motif expressed in our culture? So now you've had a chance to answer the question, what are some examples of this idea that man is a conqueror of the natural world? And there are some obvious ones, right? There's the idea that human beings want to conquer Mount Everest, or they want to conquer the North Pole, right? So the age of exploration is filled with language of conquering. People want to conquer the moon. They want to travel to Mars and all of that sort of thing. That's certainly part of it. Deeply embedded in our own culture is the idea that the European civilization that we come from was destined to conquer the United States, that indigenous peoples somehow would give way to the future, the destiny of the culture, namely us, and that we were right to conquer them and to push them off their land, to assimilate them to our culture. So we had a conquering mentality in relation to our own country, a colonial mentality. But let me give another example of how conquering is a part of the way that we experience things. And let me focus in on the feeling of vulnerability that is articulated in this passage. So maybe some of you have heard of the reality television show Naked and Afraid. The idea is that if you take a person from a normal Western society and you throw them out on their own into the natural world and they have to fend for themselves with only a knife, they're allowed to bring one thing with them. The whole fixation around that activity of surviving in the natural world is around how hard it is and how harsh nature is, how ruthless and relentless it is. And yet we lived outdoors in the natural world for hundreds of thousands of years. It's not unusual. In fact, what is unusual is for us to live in the kind of society that we currently live in, with no idea which plants are edible, how to make a tool to catch fish, or how to find your way to where you want to go, or how to heal yourself if you're sick, or where to get shelter. The thing that's unusual is our society. But our society's approach to solving the problem of how to live is to impose order, to build a house, exclude everything else, exclude the natural world. So, the world was made for man, and we were made to conquer and rule it. And under our rule, it was meant to become a paradise, a wonderful place for us to live. But the thing that we've noticed increasingly over the last few centuries is that it isn't becoming a paradise. The natural world is getting sicker, and we're undermining our own ability to live and thrive in it. How do we respond to that? Ishmael focuses us in on the way that the story itself comes up with a new plot point. So the world was made to become a paradise. How do we account for the fact that it's not? The fact that we are destroying that world, that it's not working out for us, that we're screwing things up accidentally, not on purpose. It's explained away in the story as being rooted in an inherent flaw in human beings. How do we respond to that flaw? Well, okay, so we cause some damage to the natural world when we're extracting the minerals from the earth to build things with. How do we respond to that situation? Well, we need more control. We need to take the stuff from the earth and we have to purify it. If only we could control the processes of the natural world, like when we create genetically modified products, we can make them better. So the answer to the flaws of agriculture, the modern way we practice agriculture, which are making the soil more and more impoverished, making the soil thinner, less rich, less full of life. The solution to that problem is more control, engineering the plants that grow, spreading our own artificial fertilizer on the soil, killing off the bugs that we don't want eating our food. So the solution to our flaws, the solution to the problems we're causing, is more control, more rule. So the story is preserved. The premise is preserved. So if human beings are flawed, then we still have this question. How do we find out how to live well? How do we find out how to live? How do we solve the problems that we're creating? So we are asking this question, and we ask this question in our society. What is the best way to live? And our society only looks at itself. Because we consider ourselves to be the destiny and purpose and goal of living things, but also the destiny and destination of all human culture, it doesn't even occur to us to go and check, say, with indigenous people, even though they've been living sustainably for thousands and thousands of years. It doesn't even occur to us to ask how animals live together in society with each other. Why would we model ourselves and our relationships and our attitudes on the way that animals live? We're superior to them, the story tells us. They exist, sure, but their purpose is us. Their goal, their destination that is set for them by the way things are, is to culminate in us. So our society closes itself off to other creatures and other ways of living and only looks at itself. So Ishmael says we have to open that door, open the door or climb over the wall that our society has erected in between us and the natural world. We have to climb over that wall in order to find out how to live, how to correct the problems that we have been creating in our culture. So in the next class, we're going to have a look at how it is that we could actually learn how to live from nature. In doing that, we are asking, what are the laws of life? How is life organized? How is it that we can incorporate the way that life is organized into our culture, into a culture that is not living in such a way as to hold the world captive?